You're watching Strictly Security. Thank you for staying with us. In the 50 years that passed since the 1973 Yom Kippur War, it has become a symbol synonymous to failure and incompetence. However, this war, along with the painful trauma, opened many doors for the young Jewish state. One of them led to historic peace with Israel's biggest enemy at the time, Egypt. Here is our interview with the former Israeli ambassador to Egypt, Mr. Itzhak Levanon. Itzhak Levanon, former Israeli ambassador to Egypt, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.
50 years since the Yom Kippur War, a huge wound in Israel's history. Where were you at the time?
Well, precisely in Yom Kippur, I was at the United Nations, part of the Israeli delegation. We were working in the Security Council and the General Assembly in order to reach a ceasefire. And it took a while, until we have reached that objective.
I bet that at the time, being there, being very much concerned of what's going on in Israel, you couldn't have imagined having peace with Egypt, not mentioning being the ambassador to Egypt.
Nobody thought about that at the time. We were really totally absorbed by the fact that we need a ceasefire, that we need, to calm down the situation and to stop the fighting and the bloodshed. This was the main objective. Nobody thought at the time that we are going to have peace with Egypt. It came, later on, after the war. And here, I noticed that there is something very important, the difference of the approach between the Egyptians and the Israeli approach.
Remaining at that time, how much were you concerned of what's going on here? Because in Israel, I was a young kid at the time, but in Israel, people were afraid of it might be the end of the state.
It was scary. It was scary because the delegation we have received, let's say, the real and genuine information coming from the ground. I was personally very scared, but I was annoyed, let's say, against the delegations in the United Nations, which they did not take into account the sensibility, the feeling of the Israelis, and they were harsh with Israel, and this, sorry to say it, makes me really very annoyed.
And at the time, the world wasn't very fond of Israel because that was 6 years after the 6 Days War and the Arab boycott, which was very, very fundamental.
Look, the Soviets at the time, if I'm going back to the United Nations, they play a negative role in the debates, discussing Israel and mobilizing the others against Israel also. And this annoyed me personally very much. I was a young diplomat, and I thought that the United Nations, this is the melting pot of all the ideas and all the people. And suddenly I found out that this is not the case. And we are facing here some institution which is hardly and harshly against the state of Israel. And, it left some impact on me in this regard. But we had to fight. And we did it at the United Nations with our delegation and Joe Tekoa, who was the head of the delegation. He was excellent. He was really a real ambassador, and he handled the situation very well.
At the time, did you have any engagements, connections, talks, if at all, with the Arabs, with Arab states, Arab delegations?
Yes, but to a minimum extent. It comes later on, after the war. But for instance, when I was sitting at the United Nations at the Security Council, I was witness, of the fight between two diplomats, one Egyptian and one Syrian. They were fighting about the ceasefire. The Syrian was against the Egyptian. Why do you agree to a ceasefire with the Israelis? Because we have decided to go to war together, and we have decided also to stop the war together. And the Egyptians say, look, he called at the time, not Israel, the Jewish, look, El Yahud, the Jewish are pressuring us very much, so we had to accept the ceasefire. So in this regard, yes, a little bit of contacts, but the real contacts came later on in my diplomatic life.
So let's proceed to the period after the war. Apparently, the war played a huge role in getting Israel and the Egyptians into a route which led into the peace peace process between the two states, and finally by signing the accord in Washington. Take me back to those times and to the influence of that war.
Not at the beginning. That's immediately after the war. We had to heal the wounds, and we have to, to rehabilitate the self-confidence inside Israel. The same thing, by the way, in Egypt. I mean, but in Egypt, they were more, let's say, quote unquote, victorious, because they have waived the shame of El-Naksa, of the war of 1967, the Six-Day War. So the whole process to reach the peace came much, much later on. At the beginning, Sadat didn't want to reach a peace with us. He had in mind one thing, and his objective was, and he did not change this objective, to restitute Sinai and open the Suez Canal. This is for him to waive the shame of the Six-Day War. This is what he wanted, and he worked in that direction. From our side, we were not prepared for a full-fledged peace. So the whole idea, when everything started together with Kissinger and the Americans and the others, it was a kind maximum of a non-belligerency, a maximum. It was only later on when we started really, and he came to Jerusalem, and we started to talk, the pressure of the American and the American administration, that suddenly things started to change, and we see there is a possibility of a full peace. But it took time. It took time.
Many Israelis, including the chief of staff at the time, Mota Gur, were very suspicious of the Egyptians' intentions. Many of them said that it's a trap.
I don't blame him. I don't agree with him, but I don't blame him. You see, we have lived with Egypt, and we have conducted, like, if I'm not mistaken, 5 wars. So there is a huge impact on the mentality of the Israelis. You don't trust your enemy because you fight 5 times. So I don't blame him, but the problem was he had in his entourage the intelligence, the politicians, all the people. Probably he should have listened a little bit more for the others before saying that in public.
Living many years later in Egypt, Egyptians look at that peace as a success, as a failure. They look at Sadat as a hero, as a villain.
First of all, concerning the peace, not all the Egyptians, they agree with the peace with Israel. We still have a substantial portion of the population who believe we should not go to peace with Israel. But you have also another portion which says, look, it is good, prosperity in Egypt, we don't have war, we don't have bloodshed, it is good. Concerning Sadat, each one of the presidents in Egypt, they gave him a title. For instance, Gamal Abdel Nasser was the eternal leader, eternal. Sadat was the hero of peace and the hero of war. This is the title of Sadat.
And he gained Sinai back, and he opened the Suez Canal.
Yes, and he did peace with Israel. But it was a process, steps by step.
At the time, and you know it better than I do, the Arab world looked at him as a traitor.
Correct.
Currently, when we speak about normalization with Saudi Arabia, following Morocco and Bahrain and Sudan and the UAE, everything seems very normal.
Look, things have changed in the Middle East during the years. I mean, it was obvious and it was expected. The only question that we had with the diplomats, when we were discussing the issue is how long it will take. How long it will take until everything will be seen like normal. Not normalization, but seen like normal. And this is only now, after 75 years. I believed, at the beginning when I was a young cadet, diplomat, that maybe 50 years. But it took 75 years.
Better late than never.
Look, it's correct because we're living in this region, in this area, and we're not going anywhere. So you have to reach something. But the Arabs were, at the time of the Yom Kippur War of 50 years ago, they were still under the influence of the 3 no's of Khartoum in Sudan. So suddenly, one of the leaders, and Egypt was at the time also the
leader of the Arab world.
Suddenly he goes to the Yahud, to the Jewish, and discuss with them things which are really a heresy. I mean, it was heretic. Peace with the Yahud. So this is why they were really very upset on him. And this is why they ask also the Arab League to leave Cairo and to move to Tunis. I was in the Arab League in Tunis to watch what's going on. But finally, I think that the reason in the Middle East took over, and this is the situation today. They understand that the situation have changed, the Middle East have changed, the world have changed. And all the elements have changed. You know, we have terrorism now, and we have again, you know, the fight between the powers, etc. So things has to change, and
the Arab world, speaking of Shiite and Sunni, Iran and the others, that has changed dramatically as well. And Egypt has changed. Egypt has been the leader at 73. It is less of a leader currently, speaking of Saudi Arabia.
Look, to be candid with you, and I'm giving you, you know, my opinion. I know that there is a rift, you know, between Shiite and Sunnite, but this is history. When it comes to Israel, they're all together. They don't care. Sunni and Shia, they fight together. Hezbollah, Nasrallah, he's a Shiite. He's not fighting, you know, with Hamas, who is a Sunni, against Israel? Yes. When you go to Pakistan, Afghanistan, etc., they kill each other on the basis of Sunnat and Shiite. Not when it comes to Israel. So I think that you have to be aware of the situation that we are facing a joint common enemy.
So to sum up our conversation, our interesting conversation, I take you back to 73 and I ask you, do you believe that was the last big war that we've seen in the Middle East?
Well, we have seen 3 more, in, you know, with Lebanon and with Hamas.
Not in such capacity. You take the numbers, the states.
It was. I mean, actually, 50 years later, it is the last war. If we are talking in terms of a massive war, let's say tanks against tanks,
conventional,
the conventional, the traditional war,
old-fashioned war.
Yeah, this is the last one. I mean, it's a fact that this is the last one. I believe that it is going to stay the last one because nobody has an interest. And secondly, again, I think that Egyptians today, look, they believe they are victorious in the war, etc., but they do understand that Israel, IDF, is a strong, strong army, sophisticated, advanced, with a lot of things. And they do understand this, and they do, let's say, admit it. So I believe that this is the last war.
Hopefully so. Itzhak Levanon, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me.